2019, there were an estimated 7.7 billion people living on our planet. Of those 7.7 billion people, almost 8%, or around 640 million of them, lived in just one country, China. Now, China is a massive country with lots of people, so this probably doesn't surprise you. However, when we look at the next most populated country, India, home to around 1.4 billion people, it might start to seem weird that so many humans can fit into just one country. Then we get to the United States of America, which has the third most amount of people in the world, with around 330 million people living inside its borders. And it's quite surprising how few people it actually takes to make up a country, considering the sheer size of the USA. So why hasn't anyone invaded the United States? Why is America the world's #1 superpower? And why is the US such a desirable place to live in the first place? It's me, and you're watching this channel. America is a huge country, both geographically and politically. So let's break down why exactly it's impossible to invade. The United States were formed in 1776 after declaring independence from the British Empire, and it wasn't long before the young nation found itself at war. At the time, the states had very little standing army and instead relied on citizen militias. This wasn't ideal, as often these men didn't know how to fight or even control their weapon of choice. Even by today's standards, the American Revolution wasn't particularly bloody, with around 25,000 Americans dying during the 8-year conflict, most deaths occurring due to disease and lack of medical care. The war was far from over, though, because while the US had defeated the British, they still hadn't won their independence. This would only be confirmed in 1783 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, officially ending the war and recognizing the United States as a sovereign nation. The reason why this was important is because without a war on their own soil, the newly independent United States could focus on building up their strength, not only militarily but also economically. By the time of the War of 1812 between the US and Britain, the US had grown significantly, gaining land through purchase and conquest, and now boasted a navy capable of defending its coastline. Not only this, but citizens were flocking to the US from Europe, giving America a large and varied population to draw soldiers from. But even with all of these advantages, the US lost badly in the war. In fact, they lost more territory than they gained. So why haven't they tried to take back what they lost? Well, because by this point, the US understood that they couldn't fight 2 wars at once. They were stuck between the power of Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, and they knew if they went to war with any of these European superpowers, they wouldn't stand a chance. So the best course of action was to focus on growing the country in every other way possible and wait for their time to strike. And that time came quickly. When the dust settled on World War I, the US was one of the victors. Suddenly, the US had a place on the world stage and was respected by pretty much every other country on the planet. What's even more interesting is that despite the US playing a major role in winning the war, they didn't really have to lift a finger. You see, the fighting had taken place mostly in Europe, and the US had been able to avoid getting directly involved. However, this would all change during the Second World War. During the Second World War, the US was forced to get involved after the Japanese Empire attacked Pearl Harbor. From this point on, the US would play a major role in defeating the Axis powers. And again, the US did not lose any land during the conflict. However, the US did suffer greatly in terms of lives lost, with around 400,000 American men and women dying during the war. But something interesting happened after the war ended. With the US emerging as one of the victors once again, the US had another moment on the world stage and used it to solidify their position as a global superpower. This time, though, things were different. The US had proven that they were more than capable of holding their own in a war and winning. This meant that no country would ever try to attack the US, as they knew that they wouldn't stand a chance. But let's imagine for a second that the US wasn't so powerful and no country could invade them. What if, for some reason, the US became weak and disunited? Could any country then invade and take advantage of the situation? Well, possibly. But it depends where. You see, while the US is the third most populated country on the planet, it's also the third largest country in the world. Behind it is Canada and then Russia, both countries with nuclear capabilities. To the north is Canada, who are not only culturally similar to the US, but are also bound by strong trading partnerships. To the west is the Pacific Ocean, which the US Navy dominates. To the south is Mexico, who, despite being culturally different to the US, are also bound by a strong trading partnership. and then to the east is the Atlantic Ocean, which the US also dominates. In fact, there are very few places that the US could be invaded from, with the majority of these invasions requiring the invading force to cross either the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean. Even if a country like China wanted to invade the US, it would be extremely difficult to do so, as they don't even share a border with each other. Now, you may have noticed something else about this map, and that's that the US shares a land border with two countries, Canada and Mexico. But you may have also noticed that this border is over 8,500 kilometers long. To put this into perspective, the longest sea border that the US shares with another country, and that's Canada, is around 2,400 kilometers. And even then, it's broken up into three sections by American and Canadian enclaves. So in order to successfully invade the United States, you would have to either come across the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean, or go through Canada or Mexico. The US could easily defend against invaders coming across the ocean, as they dominate both the Atlantic and Pacific with their navies. As for Canada and Mexico, well, as I said, the US shares a strong trading relationship with both of these countries, and an invasion would not only damage these trading relationships, but also cost a lot of money and lives. If you zoom out of the map enough, you can see that the US is pretty much surrounded by water. This has given the US some distinct advantages over other nations. For example, as the US has been able to grow its economy without the threat of invasion, it's become the world's largest economy. Not only this, but America's relative isolation has allowed the country to grow without interference from other countries. What I find most interesting is that this has also led to the creation of the Hollywood image of America as a melting pot of cultures. Because of the difficulty in invading the United States, America has become a place of opportunity, a place where immigrants from all over the world can come to and start a new life. If you think about it, most countries aren't like this. They're usually filled with people from the same culture and background, but America isn't like that. It's a place for everyone. This idea is encapsulated in what's known as the American dream, the belief that anyone, regardless of where they come from or what they believe in, can go to America and create a better life for themselves. There's probably no better example of this than my very own grandparents. My maternal grandfather is from Italy and my grandmother is from Scotland. Neither of these countries are particularly known for their warm climates, and yet here I am sitting in Florida as we speak, because my grandparents decided that they wanted to retire somewhere warm. And what better place than America, the land of opportunity. But let's imagine that someone actually did manage to invade the US, whether it be by sea or by land. Would they even be able to hold their ground? Well, not really. And this is where geography plays a pivotal role. See, unlike most countries in the world, the US has no real center. There are multiple cities that could claim the title of being the capital of the US because Washington, D.C. isn't even located in any state. Instead, it's in a district. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. You see, while the District of Columbia may not be a state, it's still part of the United States. In fact, there are 5 areas that aren't technically states but are still part of the US. These include Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, the Virgin Islands, and the Northern Mariana Islands. And the thing to note here is that these aren't necessarily easy places to invade. Let's take Puerto Rico, for example. If an invading force managed to capture the island, they would then need to transport their soldiers and equipment across the Caribbean Sea to the mainland US. But even then, they would only have captured one of around 50 potential entry points to the US mainland. And I guarantee you that the military bases in these locations would make things less than comfortable for any invader. So perhaps the real question shouldn't be, why can't America be invaded? But why would you invade America? It's controversial to say the least, and I'm sure that there are plenty of Americans watching this who disagree. But I think it's safe to say that America is one of the most desirable countries in the world to live in. It's got everything from beautiful coastlines to amazing national parks and cities with endless opportunities. I've always wanted to visit all 50 states, and one day I hope to do that. But what do you think? Do you agree that America is a desirable place to live? And do you think that it's impossible to invade? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and I'll see you next time.